My mother, José Fernandes da Silva.
At that time, I was only 6 or 7 years old, but I was already obliged to work. I would go to the other side of the river, into Basilio's woods, accompanying Geraldo, who was my foster brother, as they used to say, in search of firewood for the stove and, sometimes, also for the oven used to bake cookies. What I loved most during that time was seeing my mother's face when she was taking the cookies out of the oven. She didn't say anything, but you could tell she was very happy. It was as if she were seeing little grandchildren, one after another, chubby and rosy, being born at that very moment. The oven, located outside on the porch that faced the backyard, resembled a giant termite mound, like the ones scattered across the fields. It had an opening on the side, just the right size for the lids filled with unbaked cheese bread or cornmeal cakes to be placed inside with the help of a wooden paddle, onto a hotbed of stones. When looked at from the outside in, and from the bottom up, through that opening, called the mouth of the oven, it was like a little house with a rounded or domed roof, reminiscent of certain indigenous dwellings or large clay birdhouses. For the oven to be ready for baking, it had to get very hot, and that required a lot of firewood. Consequently, it increased the sacrifices that Geraldo and I had to endure. But there was the compensation of being able to taste some of those cookies, which were made not to be eaten at home but to be sold on the street or at Milagido's store. After the firewood turned to ashes and embers, leaving the oven very hot, the embers and ashes were swept out with a broom made of fresh, fragrant branches to leave the oven clean and perfumed, with a scent that complemented the cookies. The ashes, instead of being thrown into the woods, were turned into idiquata, a dark yellow liquid capable of converting certain greasy products into soap, partly for home use and partly to be sold on the street or at the aforementioned store. Fetching firewood in Basilio's woods, usually tied in bundles and carried on our shoulders or even on our heads over a cloth pad, was not only a difficult and tiring task but also dangerous because the owner of the woods, Basilio, no longer allowed it and would set fierce dogs on us. But there was no other way because, in the little village called Aradu, or Chumbo de Patos de Minas, as they said at Dona Odite's school, there were no gas stoves, nor that type of fuel, and even less electricity. As a result, the lighting, which was very poor, could only come from a castor oil lamp with a cotton wick. Feeling the difficulties faced by Geraldo and me, our father, who was a carpenter by trade and named Evaristo but known as Lico, took pity on us and decided to make a small cart to alleviate some of our suffering. Since I was still a child and had almost no time to play, the arrival of the cart also served the purpose of allowing me to play and work at the same time, instead of just playing with ox carts made from gourds. Being much smaller than Geraldo, the yoke of the oxen was quite uneven, but he, who was like a real brother to me and not just a foster brother, found a solution. When we were pulling the cart full of firewood, especially uphill, he would stretch out his arm and grab the yoke on my side, making an effort for me so that I could do less, according to my abilities. I have never forgotten that. There was a river called the Aradu River, separating the little town from Basilio's woods, where we went to fetch firewood. I deduce that if we could cross it on foot while pulling the cart, it couldn't have been very deep. However, during the rainy season, it would swell so much that it became very dangerous, with strong currents that could even drag oxen trying to cross it. But Cato, who liked to boast, would brag that even if the river reached his doorstep, he could swim across it. And once, he actually tried to do it, and the current caught him and drowned him. The distance between the river and the house was not short. And for those returning from the river, there was an uphill climb that extended to the beginning of the street where our house was located. If Geraldo and I were the ones who had to suffer to supply the firewood, it was mostly my mother, named Manila, and my older sister, Elvira, who had to endure the hardship of fetching water, which was used not only for drinking and cooking but also for washing feet at night and, occasionally, for taking a basin bath. But my mother's suffering was even greater because, to avoid having to constantly go to the river, she did the following. She would fill 2 pots with water, place one on her head over a cloth pad, and, leaning her body to one side, support the other pot on her waist with the help of a companion. And off she went, uphill, with a somewhat staggering walk, as if she were slightly drunk. And she did this continuously throughout all the years we lived there. Years later, living in Agua Fria, near Carmo do Rio Verde, then in São Luís de Montes Belos, and later in Goiânia, her complaints of back pain were endless. She began to hunch over even before the age when it usually happens. Her constant visits to public hospitals, where doctors were poorly paid and uninterested, didn't help much, and the money to buy the prescribed medicines was scarce. Initially, they took an X-ray and saw that her spine was quite twisted, not only forward, as is common with hunchbacks, but also to one side, like a spiral. For the doctors and radiologists of that time, that X-ray was possibly an enigma, something difficult to interpret. But for me, who knew my mother's story very well and had already begun to seek the meaning of things, that X-ray was nothing but the sign of a well-known phenomenon in relation to my mother's life, her constant and endless walks uphill from the river to our house with 2 pots full of water, one on her head and the other on her waist. It was also a sign of all her suffering, especially her back pain, which she had to endure throughout almost her entire life, starting from the time we lived in Aradu or Chumbo de Patos de Minas, as our beloved teacher Dona Odit taught us. But being a true fighter, a perfect example of a homemaker, and someone who won many friendships, she managed, despite all these setbacks, to survive until the age of 93. Then, in a moment of extreme suffering due to a loss of balance and an unexpected fall that broke her hip, she had no choice but to leave this world and, according to her beliefs, set out in search of another, possibly better one, to the sorrow of all who knew her and, directly or indirectly, accompanied her on her existential journey.